Julian Ashford sat in the quiet luxury of the first-class cabin, his jaw clenched as he stared at the glowing screen of his tablet. The Ashford Group was days away from a multi-billion-dollar merger, but the board was threatening to pull the plug. His reputation had become a liability. The media painted him as a corporate machine, a ruthless shark who dismantled companies and ruined lives without a second thought. Investors were getting nervous, demanding a softer public image that Julian had no interest in providing. He took a sip of his black coffee, ready to dive back into the contracts, when a sudden commotion disrupted his peace. Sienna Hayes practically collapsed into the seat beside him. She was out of breath, her hair pulled into a messy knot, and she wore a faded, oversized sweater that looked entirely out of place among the designer suits of the other passengers. She was an emergency room nurse who had just pulled a 48-hour shift, only to be rushed to the airport for a family crisis. Due to a massive overbooking error in economy, the airline had bumped her up to the last remaining seat in first class. She did not care about the luxury or the complimentary champagne. She only cared about staying awake long enough to text her mother that she was on her way. Julian cast a cold, sideways glance at the intruder. He was used to perfectly curated environments, not exhausted women dropping their canvas tote bags onto his polished leather shoes. He expected her to apologize profusely, to cower under his intimidating stare like everyone else did. Instead, Sienna merely offered a weak, apologetic smile, murmured a quick sorry, and closed her eyes before the plane had even left the tarmac. Hours passed in heavy silence. The cabin lights dimmed, casting a soft blue glow over the sleeping passengers. Julian continued to work, ignoring the woman beside him until the plane hit a sudden violent pocket of turbulence. The aircraft jolted. Sienna shifted in her sleep, and before Julian could pull away, her head dropped softly onto his shoulder. He froze. His immediate instinct was to wake her up, to push her away and demand his personal space back. He raised his hand to tap her arm, but as he looked down, he stopped. The exhaustion on her face was profound. There were dark circles under her eyes, and her breathing was slow and steady, trusting. For the first time in his life, Julian Ashford hesitated. A strange, unfamiliar wave of restraint washed over him. Slowly, he lowered his hand, resting it on his armrest, and remained perfectly still so as not to wake her. He did not notice the passenger across the aisle quietly raising a smartphone. By the time the flight landed in New York, Julian's world had turned upside down. As he stepped off the plane, his phone exploded with messages. His business partner, Marcus Devereaux, was calling relentlessly. Julian answered, only to hear Marcus laughing in disbelief. A photograph of the ruthless CEO of the Ashford Group, allowing a tired, ordinary woman to sleep on his shoulder, had leaked online. It was trending globally. The media was calling it the humanization of Julian Ashford. The narrative had shifted overnight. Suddenly, he was not a cold-hearted tycoon. He was a protector, a hidden romantic. Marcus made it clear that the board was thrilled. The investors were charmed. The merger was back on the table, but there was one condition. The public wanted to know who the mystery woman was. They needed to see more of this softer Julian. They needed a romance. It took Julian's team less than 12 hours to track her down. He found Sienna at the end of her shift at a chaotic city clinic, looking just as tired as she had on the plane. When he stepped out of his Blacktown car, wearing a bespoke suit that cost more than she made in a year, she did not look impressed. She looked annoyed. He cornered her in the narrow alley behind the clinic, blocking her path. He did not waste time with pleasantries. He pulled a checkbook from his jacket, quickly writing out a sum with enough zeros to change a normal person's life, and held it out to her. He explained the situation with clinical precision. He needed her to pretend to be his fiancée for the next 3 months until the merger was finalized. In exchange, she would never have to work another grueling shift again. Sienna looked at the check, then looked up into Julian's dark, arrogant eyes. Her expression was unreadable for a moment, before she reached out, took the check and slowly tore it directly down the middle. She let the pieces fall onto the wet pavement. "You do not have enough money in your accounts to buy my dignity, Mr. Ashford," she said, her voice steady and sharp. "Just because your life is a series of transactions does not mean mine is. I do not want your money, and I certainly do not want to pretend to love a man who thinks he can just purchase a person like a piece of real estate. Julian was stunned. No one spoke to him like that. No one walked away from that kind of money. He watched her turn on her heel and march toward the subway, her head held high. A strange spark of admiration ignited in his chest. She was proud, fierce, and entirely immune to his power. But Julian did not become a billionaire by giving up. He had his investigators dig deeper, and what he found changed the game entirely. Sienna was drowning. Her family had been devastated by a predatory financial scam years ago, leaving her to shoulder a massive mountain of debt to keep her sick mother in a specialized care facility. She was working 3 jobs just to keep them afloat. She was proud, but she was desperate. The next day, Julian did not bring a check. He brought a contract. He met her in the sterile waiting room of the hospital where her mother was staying. He did not offer her wealth. He offered her a way out of her nightmare. He promised to clear the family debt and cover all medical expenses for the rest of her mother's life. Sienna read the contract in silence. Her hands trembled slightly as the weight of the reality crashed down on her. She hated him for knowing her weakness, for using it against her. But she loved her mother more than she valued her own pride. "I will do it," she finally whispered, her eyes meeting his with a fiery defiance. "But understand this. I am signing a business agreement. I will smile for the cameras, and I will attend your dinners. But you will never own me, Julian, and do not expect me to bow down to your world just because you paid the entrance fee." Julian nodded, hiding the unexpected jolt her words gave him. It was a deal. But as they walked out of the hospital side by side, stepping into the blinding flashes of the waiting paparazzi, Julian realized that controlling Sienna Hayes was going to be the most difficult negotiation of his life. The transition into Julian's world was as cold as the polished marble floors of his penthouse. Sienna moved into the sprawling guest wing, keeping her worn canvas bags zipped shut and politely refusing to let his extensive staff unpack for her. She attended the extravagant dinners and the high-profile charity galas, wearing the exquisite designer gowns his stylists provided, but she wore them like armor. She rejected every piece of expensive jewelry Julian tried to offer as an incentive, proudly wearing a simple faded silver chain her father had given her instead. When Julian tried to dictate her schedule, demanding she quit her job at the clinic to be fully available for his public appearances, she openly defied him. She stood in the center of his massive, empty living room, her eyes blazing, and told him that his money bought her presence at his side, not her soul. She would continue to work. She would continue to serve people who actually needed help. And if he did not like it, he could explain to the board why his beloved fiancée walked out. Julian, unaccustomed to such fierce resistance, found himself stepping back, a reluctant respect taking root in his chest. The tension between them was a physical presence, heavy and constant, but it slowly began to change shape. Late one night, after a brutal double shift at the clinic followed by a grueling 2-hour press conference, Sienna collapsed on the plush velvet sofa in his private library, shivering with a sudden, violent fever. Julian found her there, wrapped tightly in her thin sweater. Instead of calling his medical staff or his housekeeper, he sat down beside her. He dismissed the maids, brought her a glass of water himself, and draped a heavy cashmere blanket over her trembling shoulders. He stayed awake until dawn, quietly reading through complex merger contracts in the dim light, while making sure her fever broke. When she opened her eyes in the pale morning sun, she found the ruthless billionaire fast asleep in an armchair, a damp cloth still resting loosely in his hand. It was a small, silent gesture of genuine care that cracked the thick, protective walls she had built around her heart. But the fragile peace was violently shattered at the Sterling Capital Anniversary Gala. Vanessa Sterling, Julian's sharp and calculating ex-fiancée, watched the new couple with venomous suspicion from across the ballroom. Vanessa had never accepted their breakup, viewing Julian as a lost asset rather than a lost love, and she was determined to prove that Sienna was a fraud. Using her vast corporate network, Vanessa aggressively dug into the ashes of Sienna's past. She uncovered the tragic details of the financial ruin that had destroyed the Hayes family. Armed with the toxic information, Vanessa cornered Sienna in the lavish mirrored powder room of the gala, her smile dripping with malice. Vanessa revealed the dark truth that Julian had kept buried deep within his corporate archives. The predatory financial firm that had wiped out Sienna's family savings and driven her father to an early grave had been a failing, corrupt subsidiary. And exactly 5 years ago, it had been aggressively acquired and quietly liquidated by none other than the Ashford Group. Julian had directly profited from the very destruction that had ruined her life. Sienna felt the air violently leave her lungs. The betrayal cut deeper than she could have ever anticipated, twisting the knife in her chest. When Julian found her standing alone on the windy terrace, looking out over the glittering city skyline, she did not scream. She did not throw her champagne glass. Her silence was a far more devastating weapon. She looked at him not with fiery anger, but with a hollow, crushing disappointment, and calmly told him that she finally knew exactly how he had built his flawless empire. The distance between them instantly grew into a vast, freezing ocean. She stopped speaking to him outside of mandated public events. She performed her role perfectly for the flashing cameras, smiling brightly and holding his hand. But the moment the heavy doors of the penthouse closed, she vanished into her room, leaving him alone in a suffocating, unbearable silence. For the first time in his calculated life, Julian felt the agonizing, sharp sting of guilt. His massive wealth suddenly felt entirely useless. He knew perfectly well that offering her diamonds or luxury cars would only insult her further, widening the chasm between them. Instead, he desperately sought redemption in quiet, unseen spaces. He ordered his drivers to take the long, congested route home so he could personally step out into the rain and buy the cheap, bitter coffee she loved from the tiny bodega near her clinic. He left small, uncredited bouquets of vibrant wild daisies on her kitchen counter, the only flower she ever stopped to look at. He even began canceling crucial morning meetings just to ensure the penthouse remained completely quiet so she could sleep undisturbed after her exhausting night shifts. But Vanessa Sterling was not finished. Furious that her devastating revelation had not caused a public, humiliating breakup at the gala, she ruthlessly escalated her attack. Vanessa contacted a ruthless editor at a major media outlet, offering them a leaked, unredacted copy of the fake engagement contract, intending to destroy both Julian's fragile merger and Sienna's reputation in one fatal strike. They had exactly 24 hours before the scandalous story went live, a ticking clock threatening to cut off the funding for Sienna's mother and burn the Ashford Group to the ground. The clock was mercilessly ticking down, leaving them with less than 24 hours before Vanessa Sterling released the unredacted contract to the world. Julian knew that playing defense would only prolong the bleeding. He needed to strike, and he needed to do it in the only language Vanessa understood: power. He called an emergency press conference at the Ashford Group headquarters, inviting every major financial news network in the city. When he stepped up to the podium, the room was blinding with camera flashes. Sienna stood quietly in the wings, her heart pounding against her ribs. She had no idea what he was about to do. She scanned the front row and saw Vanessa sitting there, an arrogant, victorious smirk painted across her face, waiting for the inevitable collapse of Julian's empire. Julian adjusted the microphones, his face completely unreadable. He did not issue a denial. He did not attempt a cover-up. Instead, he looked directly into the camera lenses and calmly told the absolute truth. He confessed that the engagement had indeed started as a corporate strategy, a desperate attempt to salvage a merger. The room erupted into chaotic murmurs, and Vanessa's smirk widened. But Julian raised a hand, silencing the crowd, and pressed a button on the podium. The massive digital screens behind him lit up, not with an apology, but with decades of buried financial records. Julian's voice turned dangerously quiet and razor-sharp. He explained that while investigating the leaked contract, his security team had uncovered exactly who had orchestrated the extortion. He pulled up irrefutable digital trails, audio recordings, and offshore banking records, broadcasting them live to the world. The documents proved that Vanessa was heavily shorting the Ashford Group stock, attempting to profit billions from the very scandal she had manufactured. But Julian was not finished. He changed the slide, bringing up the history of the predatory subsidiary that had ruined the Hayes family. He revealed the final devastating piece of the puzzle. Julian had bought that failing company to dismantle it and fire its corrupt board, but the original architect of the predatory loans, the silent partner who had funded the destruction of Sienna's father, was none other than Sterling Capital, Vanessa's own family. The silence in the press room was deafening. Vanessa's face drained of all color. Her phone immediately began buzzing frantically, followed by the phones of every investor and board member in her inner circle. The media turned their cameras entirely on her, capturing the exact moment her pristine reputation shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces. She was no longer a powerful socialite. She was a disgraced fraud, exposed on live television. Security guards gently but firmly escorted a trembling, humiliated Vanessa out of the building as the financial network scrambled to report the unprecedented corporate takedown. When the press conference finally ended, Julian found Sienna standing in the quiet, empty hallway behind the auditorium. She was staring at him, tears welling in her eyes as the heavy, suffocating weight of her past was finally lifted. Julian did not look like a victorious billionaire. He looked exhausted and entirely vulnerable. He reached into his tailored jacket, pulled out the original physical copy of their engagement contract, and without a word, he ripped it in half. He tore it again and again, dropping the pieces onto the carpeted floor. He stepped closer, his voice thick with raw emotion. "I am sorry, Sienna. I am so deeply sorry for everything. I was arrogant enough to think I could buy a solution to my problems, and blind enough to ignore the human cost of the world I lived in. You were right about me from the moment we met in that alley. But you changed me. I do not want an arrangement. I do not want a contract. I just want you. So I love you, and I will spend the rest of my life proving it to you if you will let me." Sienna looked at the shredded paper on the floor, and then up into the sincere, desperate eyes of the man who had just risked his entire empire to avenge her family. The cold, unyielding wall around her heart finally melted away. She reached out, her fingers gently tracing the line of his jaw, and she pulled him into a desperate, passionate kiss. It was a promise, real and unshakable, forged in the ashes of their pride and the absolute certainty of their love. 2 years later, the morning sun shone brightly over a massive, newly constructed building in the heart of the city. Sienna stood on the wide front steps, wearing a crisp white medical coat, smiling as she cut the thick red ribbon. It was the Hayes Community Clinic, a state-of-the-art facility providing free healthcare to families who had lost everything. Julian stood proudly by her side, holding her hand. He had stepped down as the ruthless CEO of the Ashford Group, choosing instead to run the company's new philanthropic foundation. As the crowd cheered and children ran through the open doors, Julian looked down at Sienna, his eyes filled with a quiet, endless warmth. He wrapped his arm around her waist, pulling her close, knowing that of all the deals he had ever made, the one that cost him everything was the only one that truly gave him the world. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to hear a good story of love and redemption. Subscribe to the channel to follow our next stories, and we will see you next time.
Decidiu no roteiro enviado, o texto narrativo em inglês americano e. Texto colado. Editar. The infographic presents the story of Julian Ashford and Sienna Hayes as more than a romance between two people from opposite worlds. It shows how love develops only after power, pride, fear, and social inequality are confronted. Their first meeting on the airplane symbolizes the collision between privilege and exhaustion. Julian travels in comfort while managing a billion-dollar merger, while Sienna arrives after an extreme hospital shift, physically and emotionally depleted. Her condition represents burnout, caregiver fatigue, and the hidden cost of professions built around serving others. The viral photograph changes Julian's public image, but it also introduces one of the story's central conflicts. A private moment of tenderness becomes a corporate asset. Investors, board members, and the media transform Sienna into a solution for Julian's reputation problem. His fake engagement proposal reveals how deeply he believes that every obstacle can be solved through money and control. Sienna's refusal to accept his first check protects her dignity and establishes an essential boundary. She may be financially desperate, but she refuses to let desperation define her value. When Julian discovers her family debt and offers medical security for her mother, the agreement becomes ethically complicated. His help is real, but it comes with conditions. The infographic therefore asks whether assistance can remain moral when one person holds far more power than the other. Sienna technically agrees, yet her circumstances limit how freely she can choose. This imbalance reflects broader social problems involving medical debt, long-term care, economic inequality, and the vulnerability of families facing illness. As the relationship develops, Julian begins to change through small acts rather than grand displays of wealth. Caring for Sienna during her fever, respecting her work, protecting her rest, and learning what brings her comfort show the gradual replacement of control with empathy. Genuine emotional growth is not proven by public speeches or expensive gifts. It is demonstrated through consistency, attention, and respect. The revelation about the company connected to Sienna's family ruin creates the deepest fracture between them. Her silence reflects betrayal and the collapse of trust. Julian must finally face the human consequences of the corporate world that made him powerful. His redemption begins only when he stops defending his image and accepts responsibility. At the press conference, he risks his merger, exposes Vanessa's manipulation, reveals the truth about Sterling Capital, and destroys the contract that once defined their relationship. The final image of the Hayes Community Clinic connects personal redemption with social responsibility. Julian's transformation is complete because he does not simply win Sienna's love. He uses his resources to repair harm and create lasting healthcare access for vulnerable families. Sienna also retains her identity, profession, and purpose. Their love becomes believable because it is no longer based on performance, debt, or obligation. The story ultimately teaches that dignity cannot be purchased, trust must be rebuilt through honest action, and power becomes meaningful only when it is used to protect rather than control.